The zipper on my wedding dress stuck at the same spot it always did. Right at the curve of my lower back, that stubborn little inch of fabric that refused to cooperate no matter how many times the seamstress had adjusted it. I stood in the middle of Elaine's bridal on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks before what was supposed to be the most important day of my life, and I laughed about it. I actually laughed. I should have known then that something was already broken. My name is Vivienne Caldwell, and I had spent the better part of 2 years planning a wedding that I believed, with every cell in my body, was exactly what I wanted. The venue was a restored Victorian estate called Thornfield Manor, 45 minutes outside the city, draped in ivy and old money charm. The flowers were blush peonies and ivory ranunculus. The cake was 4 tiers of lemon and lavender, designed by a baker who had a 6-month waiting list. We had 212 confirmed guests, a string quartet for the ceremony, and a DJ for the reception who had already been paid in full. Everything was perfect. Everything was in place. And my mother, Renata Caldwell, had her hands in every single piece of it. Now, I need to be careful here because when I tell you about my mother, I want you to understand something important. Renata was not a villain in the obvious sense. She didn't twirl mustaches. She didn't make openly cruel remarks at the dinner table. She operated in a much more sophisticated register. The slightly too long pause before she complimented something, the way she could rephrase a compliment until it became a critique, the subtle art of making you feel grateful for being corrected. She was the kind of woman who volunteered for every committee she joined, who remembered every birthday with a handwritten card, and who had, for my entire life, made it very clear that her love came pre-packaged with conditions she never fully articulated. My fiancé, Daniel Osei, had noticed it before I was willing to admit it. We'd been together for 4 years, engaged for 1, and Daniel, patient, deliberate, emotionally intelligent Daniel, had tried 3 separate times to have the conversation with me. "Your mom doesn't trust you to make your own choices," he'd said once carefully, "the way you set something fragile down. She repackages her preferences as your best interests." I defended her every time. I was still defending her on the Tuesday of the dress fitting, standing in the bridal shop with the sticky zipper and the champagne my mother had ordered without asking if I wanted any. She sat in the cream-colored armchair near the mirror, one leg crossed over the other, a glass in her hand, watching me with that expression she wore when she was calculating something. "The neckline is still too low," she said. "The neckline is exactly what I asked for," I said. "It's fine for a cocktail party. For a wedding. Mom." She sipped her champagne. "I'm just saying what other people will think. Other people aren't getting married." She smiled the way she always smiled when I pushed back, tolerant, slightly pitying, as though I were a child who hadn't yet grasped something obvious. "You're right," she said. "Of course you're right." But her eyes were still moving over the dress, cataloging every deviation from whatever vision she was holding in her head. I watched her watching me and felt something I'd been feeling more and more frequently in the past several months, a low, persistent unease like a note played slightly off-key. Daniel had wanted to elope. He'd brought it up 6 months ago, half joking at first, then less joking. "Just us, a courthouse, your best friend and my brother as witnesses. Then a dinner somewhere beautiful." He'd said it with that particular smile of his, the one that meant he was serious but giving me the chance to pretend he wasn't. I'd said no. I'd said my mother would be devastated. I'd said we'd been planning too long to pull back now. He hadn't pushed. He never pushed. But he also hadn't completely let it go. And I knew the reason even if I wasn't ready to say it out loud. The fitting ended. The seamstress marked the zipper with a pin and promised to have it fixed by Thursday. My mother air-kissed my cheek outside the shop and told me she had a few errands to run, and I drove home with the champagne buzz fading and that off-key note still humming somewhere behind my sternum. When I got home, there was an email waiting for me. It was from Thornfield Manor. I remember the exact moment I opened it, standing in my kitchen with my coat still on, my bag still on my shoulder, my keys in my hand. I remember reading the subject line, Caldwell Osei Wedding, Booking Cancellation Confirmation. I remember reading it twice because the first time, the words simply didn't assemble into a coherent meaning. Cancellation. Confirmed. Per request of Renata Caldwell. Refund processed to the credit card on file. My mother had canceled my wedding venue. I stood there for what felt like a very long time. My coat was getting warm. My keys were biting into my palm. The email just sat there on my screen, patient and irrefutable, and I genuinely could not, make myself believe that what I was reading was real. Then I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring, the way he always did, his voice carrying that particular warmth it had when he saw my name on his screen. "Hey you. How was the fitting?" "Daniel," I said, and something in my voice made him go very quiet. "Viv, what happened?" I read him the email. I read it out loud, word by word, standing in my kitchen with my coat on, and somewhere around the third sentence I started to shake in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. When I finished, there was a pause on his end. Not the pause of shock, I realized. The pause of someone who had been expecting something like this, who had been bracing for the shape of it, even if not the specifics. "I need you to call her," Daniel said. His voice was controlled in a way that told me exactly how controlled he was having to be. "I need you to call her right now, and I need you to ask her directly, and I need you to hear what she says with your own ears. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. "And Viv?" "Yeah. Whatever she tells you, I need you to actually hear it. Not the version you translate for her. What she actually says." I didn't respond to that. I hung up and called my mother. She answered on the fourth ring, which meant she'd seen it was me and taken a moment before picking up. A small thing. The kind of small thing I'd spent years not noticing. "Vivienne," she said, pleasant and unhurried. "Mom." My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I got an email from Thornfield Manor." A brief pause. Not a surprised pause. A prepared one. "Oh, I was going to call you about that." "When?" "Soon." I wanted to find the right moment. "The right moment," I repeated. "Mom, you canceled my wedding venue. Without asking me. Without telling Daniel. Without telling me. You called them and canceled it. Whose credit card was the deposit on?" "Mine," she said, and I heard the shift in her tone, the pivot from careful to righteous that I knew so well. "Which is why I had the right to." "You had the right to cancel my wedding?" "I had the right to make a decision about a financial commitment I made, yes." The kitchen was very quiet around me. I could hear the refrigerator hum. I could hear my own breathing. "Why?" I said. "Why did you do this?" And here is where the conversation took a turn I was not prepared for. Here is where my mother said something that stopped every thought in my head cold. She took a breath, and she said with the particular calm of someone who has been rehearsing, "Because I spoke to Daniel's mother last week. And she told me something about him that you need to know before you make the biggest mistake of your life." The refrigerator kept humming. My coat was still on. And I understood in that precise moment that everything I thought I knew about the last 3 weeks was about to be dismantled. But what she said next, I wasn't ready for it. Not even close. "Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing your locations." Now back to the story. The thing about a lie wrapped in the structure of a truth is that it's almost impossible to untangle in real time. My mother was extraordinarily good at this, at building a case that had just enough verifiable detail to make the rest seem credible. She'd done it my whole life, and I'd never had a name for it until a therapist I saw briefly at 24 called it strategic truth-telling. You give someone the accurate frame. You fill it with your own picture. So when she told me what Daniel's mother had allegedly said, "I want you to understand that I was not an idiot for being shaken. I want you to understand that the information was delivered with receipts, a date, a location, a specific restaurant in the part of the city where Daniel's family lived." She said she and Miriam Osei had run into each other, which was plausible because they'd met at our engagement party and exchanged numbers in the way that parents of engaged couples sometimes did. She said they'd had coffee. She said Miriam had confided in her, woman to woman, mother to mother. What she said Miriam told her was this: that Daniel had a history of walking away from serious relationships right before major milestones. That he'd been engaged once before, briefly at 27, to a woman in another city, and that he'd ended the engagement 2 weeks before the wedding with almost no explanation. That his family loved me, but they were worried. That Miriam herself had been losing sleep wondering whether Daniel was ready, whether he would do to me what he'd done before. His own mother, Renata said. She came to me because she didn't know what else to do. I stood in my kitchen and felt the floor redistribute beneath me. Here is what I knew to be true. Daniel had mentioned the previous engagement exactly once, in the early months of our relationship, with the brevity of someone who considered it a closed chapter. He'd said it hadn't worked out. He hadn't elaborated. I hadn't pressed because I didn't press. That was my own particular learned behavior, the child of a woman who treated questions as weapons. I'd filed it away and moved on. Now my mother was holding it up under a new light. "I'm telling you this because I love you," she said. "Because someone had to protect you." And there it was. Protect. The word she always used when she made decisions about my life without consulting me. She was protecting me from the neckline. She was protecting me from a venue with bad lighting. She was protecting me from a fiancé who might leave me at the altar. Every intrusion framed as a shield. Every act of control dressed in maternal love. The maddening thing, the thing that kept me frozen in my kitchen for 4 full minutes after I ended the call, was that I couldn't immediately prove she was wrong. I called Daniel back. She says your mother told her you've been engaged before. I said, and that you walked out 2 weeks before the wedding. She says Miriam is worried you'll do the same thing to me. The silence this time was different from the first one. It was the silence of someone choosing their words very carefully because they know that the wrong ones will do irreparable damage. I told you about Emily, he said. Early on. I was 27. You said it didn't work out. You didn't say you were 2 weeks from the wedding. I know. A breath. I didn't want to make it into a bigger thing than it was. We were wrong for each other. I knew it. She knew it, even if she didn't want to admit it yet. I made the call because it was the right call. Did your mother talk to mine? Another pause. I don't know. I'd have to ask her. Daniel. Viv, listen to me. His voice was low and deliberate. I need you to think about the sequence of events here. Your mother had access to money that gave her leverage. She used it before she told you anything. She didn't come to you with a concern and let you make a decision. She acted, and then she presented you with the result and a justification. Does that feel like someone trying to protect you, or someone trying to control what happens? I didn't answer. I love you, he said. You know that. But I can't keep watching you translate her actions into better intentions than they deserve. That night, I called his mother myself. Miriam Osei was a warm, precise woman who taught secondary school biology and had the kind of voice that made everything sound carefully considered. I'd always liked her. When she answered and I asked directly whether she'd had coffee with my mother recently, the pause she gave me was short and genuinely confused. Your mother, she said. No, sweetheart. I haven't spoken to Renata since the engagement party. Is everything all right? There it was. The floor didn't just redistribute this time. It opened up. Because my mother had built an entire structure on a conversation that had never happened. She'd invented Miriam's worry. She'd borrowed Daniel's real history and weaponized it with a fictional source. She'd made it woman to woman, mother to mother, because she knew those were the emotional registers I'd find hardest to dismiss. I sat down on my kitchen floor. I don't know why the floor, it just seemed like the right altitude for what I was feeling. And I stayed there for a while doing the quiet, nauseating work of reassembling everything I thought I knew about my mother. The wedding was in 3 weeks. The venue was gone. 212 guests had received invitations. The flowers were ordered. The cake was made. The dress had a pin where the zipper still needed fixing. And I had a decision to make that I wasn't sure I was brave enough to make. I called my best friend, Odette, because Odette was the person I called when I needed someone who would not soften the truth to protect my feelings. She was a litigation attorney who wore red lipstick to depositions and had once reduced a hostile witness to tears with nothing more than a well-placed pause. She was also, underneath all of that, the person who had driven me to the ER at 2 a.m. once when I had a kidney stone, who had held my hand in the waiting room and made me laugh despite everything. Viv, she said when I'd finished explaining everything. What do you want to do? I don't know. Yes, you do. You know. You're just scared to say it because saying it makes it real. I closed my eyes on my kitchen floor. The refrigerator was still humming. I want to get married, I said. I want to marry Daniel. I want to have the wedding. The venue is gone, there are 200 people expecting. Stop, Odette said. One problem at a time. Do you want to deal with your mother right now? Or do you want to save your wedding first? Can I do both? No. Pick one. I picked the wedding. What happened next is the part of this story I could not have predicted if I'd tried for 100 years. It started with a phone call I made on a desperate Tuesday evening, with the specific recklessness of someone who has nothing left to lose, to a venue coordinator I'd cold called from a list I found online. And it ended with 200 strangers deciding, without any obligation whatsoever, to become my family. But first, I had to get through the worst night of my life. The night I drove to my mother's house to have the conversation we had never, in 31 years, been able to have. The porch light was on. Her car was in the driveway. The hydrangeas she'd planted in May were starting to bloom. It all looked so ordinary. It looked so much like home. I sat in my car for 11 minutes. And then I went to ring the bell. What I found on the other side of that door was something I was absolutely not prepared for. If you're still watching right now, you're exactly the kind of viewer I love. Subscribe so I can keep giving you stories that touch your heart. Hit that bell so you never miss what happens next. My mother opened the door already dressed for an argument. I don't mean that literally. She was wearing her house clothes, soft gray trousers, and a pale blue cardigan. But there was something in her posture, in the set of her chin, that told me she'd been waiting for this. She'd known I would come. She'd prepared. "Come inside," she said, stepping back to let me pass. I didn't move. I talked to Miriam. She didn't flinch, which was impressive. She blinked once, slowly, like she was processing new information she was already expecting. "Come inside," she said again. "You invented the conversation, Mom. Miriam never called you. She hasn't spoken to you since the engagement party." Renata stepped back from the door and walked toward the kitchen, and I followed because I didn't know what else to do with the momentum of my body. Her kitchen was immaculate the way it always was, counters cleared, herbs growing in their small clay pots on the windowsill, the faint smell of whatever she'd had for dinner. She filled a glass of water and set it on the table in front of the chair she expected me to sit in. I sat. I picked up the glass, then put it down. "Why?" I asked. She sat across from me, her hands folded in front of her, and she took a breath that was almost a sigh. "Because you don't listen," she said. "You have never listened. I tried to talk to you about Daniel, about the pace of things, about whether you were ready, and you shut me down every single time. I didn't have a choice. You fabricated a conversation between yourself and his mother. I used a framing that I thought you would take seriously. You lied to me." She looked at the table. "I did what I had to do. Those 5 words. 5 words, and the whole architecture of my childhood rearranged itself. I'd spent 31 years inside a story where my mother made controlling decisions because she loved me so fiercely she didn't always get the methods right. I'd spent 31 years offering her that grace, that interpretation, that softer framing. And here she was finally, without the performance of justification, telling me plainly, I did what I had to do. Not I was scared for you. Not I didn't handle it well. She did what she had to do. The goal was the goal. The methods were just methods. Do you even like him? I asked. Daniel, do you actually have a problem with him? Or is this about something else entirely? She looked up. He's going to take you away from me. There it was. Not his previous engagement. Not any genuine concern about his readiness or his character. He was going to take me away from her, which meant, in her language, that he was going to become the person I needed most, and she couldn't tolerate the demotion. I sat with that for a moment. I let it land. I thought about all the versions of this conversation I'd rehearsed in my head, and how none of them had prepared me for it to be this simple, this raw, this honest after all the years of elaborate indirection. I love you, I said finally. I do, but I'm getting married, and you don't get to decide whether that happens. She said nothing. I need you to call Thornfield Manor and tell them it was a mistake. I need the refund reversed. The cancellation has already been processed. They have another booking for that weekend. I closed my eyes for 3 seconds. Of course they did. 3 weeks out from a Saturday in June, a venue like Thornfield Manor wouldn't sit empty. Someone was already planning their own version of a wedding in my stolen slot. Then I'll find something else, I said. Vivienne, I'm getting married, Mom. With or without a venue. With or without you. I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel and my jaw set, and when I got back to my apartment I sat down at my laptop and started making calls. It was 9:47 at night. I called 4 venues. Every single one of them said the same thing. Fully booked, we're so sorry, 3 weeks' notice is impossible, have you tried? And then they'd name somewhere else that was also booked. Odette, who had been texting me throughout the drive home, and the conversation with my mother that I'd given her in real-time updates, called me at 11:15. How are you holding up? I've called 9 venues, I said. Nothing. Okay. New approach. Tell me what you actually need. Not the manor, not the string quartet. What do you actually need to get married? I thought about it. Daniel, I said. My people. And somewhere to put them. Somewhere to put 200 people, she said. 212. Right. I could hear her thinking. Do you remember that thing my cousin did a few years ago? When his original venue fell through. He posted on one of those neighborhood Facebook groups asking if anyone had a big backyard, and... Odette, I am not getting married in a stranger's backyard. I'm not saying a backyard. I'm saying the internet. I'm saying, Viv, what if you just told the truth? Online. You have an Instagram, you have followers, not a ton but some. What if you just told people exactly what happened and asked if anyone could help? I stared at my screen. That's insane. It's 3 weeks until your wedding and you have nothing. Insane is relative right now. She was right. She was also, as she frequently was, one step ahead of me. While I'd been calling venues, Odette had already drafted a post. She sent it to me while we were still on the phone. It was about 300 words, plain spoken and specific, and it told the whole story. The cancellation, the reason, the timeline, without naming my mother, without excessive drama, just the bare human fact of someone trying to get married and having the floor yanked out from under them. Post it, she said. What if no one responds? Then you're exactly where you are right now, and we try something else. I posted it at 11:52 on a Tuesday night with no real expectation, because expectations had not been serving me well recently. I woke up to what I can only describe as an avalanche. The post had been shared 400 times by 7 a.m. By noon it was over 2,000. My phone had been buzzing continuously since 6 in the morning, and when I finally had the courage to open the notifications, what I found there rearranged something fundamental in my understanding of the world. Messages. Hundreds of them. From strangers. Venue offers. Catering offers. A woman in the next neighborhood over with a restored barn on her property that sat 250. A retired florist offering to source flowers at cost. 3 separate people who said they'd worked in event planning and would give their weekend for free if I needed help. A baker who made wedding cakes offering to create something in 2 weeks if I could provide the flavor profile. A man with a sound system who did weddings professionally and had the following Saturday open. And buried in the middle of all of it, a message from a woman named Gloria Tran. Gloria Tran was 64 years old, a retired landscape architect, and she owned a property outside the city that had been in her family for 3 generations. She'd read my post. She said it reminded her of something that had happened to her 40 years ago, a wedding disrupted, plans dismantled, a day that almost didn't happen. She said if I was willing, she'd like to offer me her property for the wedding, free of charge, because some things deserve to happen even when other things tried to stop them. I read her message 3 times. Then I called Odette. Someone's offering me their family property, I said. How does it look? I don't know. I just have the message. Call her. I called her. And what Gloria told me about her property, about what she'd done with it, about the particular quality of the light there in the late afternoon. I knew by the end of the conversation that this was where I was getting married. I knew it the way you know some things, not through analysis but through something older and less articulable. There was just one problem. 200 strangers were ready to give me a wedding. The string quartet had already called to say they'd seen the post and were still available. The vendors were falling into place with a speed that felt almost supernatural. But I hadn't told Daniel's family yet. And Daniel had something he needed to tell me first. Something he'd been holding back, something that had nothing to do with his previous engagement, something that I suspect he'd been trying to find the right moment to say for weeks. He'd called while I was on the phone with Gloria. He'd left a voicemail. When I listened to it, I had to sit down. The voicemail was 43 seconds long. Daniel had a voice that was naturally unhurried, the kind of voice that sounds like it has time, like it knows that the words will arrive, and there's no need to rush them. But in those 43 seconds, I could hear something underneath the careful cadence. A tension he was working to contain, a thing pressing against the structure of his composure. He said, "Viv, I need to talk to you about something before this goes any further. Not about my mother, not about yours, about me. I should have said this sooner. I think I didn't because I was scared of how it would land, and that wasn't fair to you. Call me when you can. I love you." I called him. He picked up immediately like he'd been sitting with his phone, and I said without preamble, "Tell me." He told me. It was not what I expected. It was not an affair, not a secret, not another woman or another life or any of the dark shapes my mind had already begun assembling in the silence between his message and my call. It was something smaller than that, and in a different way, far more significant. He told me he'd been offered a job. A serious one, the kind that comes once, maybe twice, in a career. A research position with an environmental nonprofit headquartered in Nairobi, working on water access infrastructure across 3 East African countries. It was everything he'd spent the last decade building toward. They'd approached him 2 months ago. He'd been in quiet conversation with them for 8 weeks, telling himself he was just gathering information, just listening, not yet deciding. He hadn't told me because he didn't know how to tell me without it feeling like an ultimatum. Stay or go. Choose me or choose this. When would you have to leave? I said. 6 months from now. Maybe 7. And they know you're getting married? They know. They said partners are welcome. The position is a 3-year commitment, but they're flexible on. Viv, I want you to know that I wasn't going to take it without talking to you. I was never going to just go. But I also didn't want to bring it up in the middle of everything with your mother and the wedding stress, and then everything blew up yesterday and Daniel. Yeah. Do you want this job? A pause. Not the calculating kind. The honest kind. Yes, he said. Then we're going to have to talk about Nairobi. I heard him exhale, a long, releasing breath, the sound of someone who has been holding something in their lungs for too long. Yeah, he said again. We are. But first, I said, I need to tell you about a woman named Gloria. I told him about the post. I told him about the 200 strangers and the retired florist and the barn in the next neighborhood and the baker with the short timeline. And then I told him about Gloria Tran and her family property and the quality of the light in late afternoon and the 3-generation history of the land and how I had, in 45 minutes on the phone with a complete stranger, become absolutely certain that this was where our marriage was supposed to begin. He was quiet for a moment. When do we go see it? He said. We drove out the next morning. The two of us, no parents, no Odette, just Daniel and me in his car on a Thursday with the windows down and the early June air coming in warm and a little humid. Gloria's property was an hour north of the city, and for the last 20 minutes of the drive, the highway became a country road that became a narrower road lined with old oak trees whose branches met overhead. The GPS was unreliable out here. We had to call Gloria twice for directions. She met us at the gate, a small, compact woman with close-cropped silver hair and laugh lines cut deep around her eyes, wearing gardening gloves and carrying a pair of shears, like she'd been out in the grounds when she heard us coming. She shook our hands and looked at Daniel with the particular assessment of someone who had lived long enough to read people quickly. You look like a man who just got his life sorted out, she said to him. He laughed, surprised then genuine. I'm getting there, he said. She took us through the property. I need you to understand what I'm describing, because I want you to feel it the way I felt it walking through with Daniel's hand in mine and Gloria narrating 3 generations of history in a voice like she was reading something she'd memorized in childhood. The main house was old stone, covered in the kind of ivy that takes decades to grow that thick. Behind it, the land opened into a wide, sweeping field bordered by a forest of old-growth trees, and in the center of the field was a natural hollow, a gentle bowl shape in the earth that Gloria said her grandmother had called the gathering place. Local families had used it for celebrations for as long as anyone could remember. Someone had been married there in 1962. There had been a wake there in 1978 for a beloved farmer. There had been a birthday party every year for 20 years that had eventually become a neighborhood institution. It was the most beautiful space I had ever stood in. The light, I said, because I didn't have a more sophisticated response. 4 o'clock is the best, Gloria said. The angle comes through the tree line right there. She pointed to the west edge of the forest, and it turns everything gold. My mother used to say the field was showing off. I felt Daniel squeeze my hand. We sat with Gloria on her stone porch afterward, and she made tea and told us what had happened to her 40 years ago, the thing she'd mentioned in her message. Her wedding had been canceled by circumstances she was not ready to detail even now, something sudden, something beyond her control, and she'd married her husband 6 months later in her parents' living room with 8 people present. She said she'd spent years feeling like she'd been cheated out of something. And then she'd spent the years after that understanding that the 8 people in her living room had held her marriage more tenderly than 200 acquaintances ever could have. But you had 200 people who wanted to show up for you, she said, looking at me. That's not nothing. Don't misunderstand me. That's something quite extraordinary. On the drive home, Daniel and I were quiet for a long time, the way you're quiet when you're both turning something over at the same time and don't need to narrate it. Are we really doing this? He said eventually. Are we really doing which part? The wedding in a stranger's field, or moving to Nairobi? Both, I suppose. I looked at him. He was watching the road, his profile calm in the afternoon light coming through the driver's window. I thought about everything we'd been through in the last 4 days. I thought about my mother on the other side of her front door with her folded hands and her 5 words. I thought about what it meant to choose someone, not once in a ceremony, but every day in the small and large decisions that constitute a life. Yes, I said. We're really doing both. He smiled. It was the smile I'd fallen in love with, the one that started slow and then arrived fully, like a word you've been waiting for. Okay, he said. Let's do it. But what neither of us knew, on that drive home with the windows down and the relief still new and fragile, was that my mother wasn't finished. She'd made one more move, one we hadn't anticipated, and we would find out about it on the morning of the wedding from the most unexpected source. We would find out, and for approximately 4 minutes, I would believe that everything was about to fall apart again. Those 4 minutes were the longest of my life. The morning of the wedding arrived with the particular clarity that June mornings sometimes carry. The sky a deep, unmarked blue, the air cool before the heat of the day built up, birdsong coming through the open windows of the room Gloria had offered us to use for getting ready. Odette had driven up the night before and was already in her dress when I woke up, sitting cross-legged on the bed with her laptop, managing what she had come to call the volunteer situation, with the focused efficiency of someone who tried cases before circuit court judges. The volunteers had, in the course of 2 weeks, become something else entirely. It had started as strangers responding to a post. It had become, through a group chat that Odette had created, and that now had 67 members, a genuine community. There was Reginald, the retired music teacher who had organized the string quartet, and then assembled a small choir from his former students as a surprise for the ceremony. There was Femi and his wife Claudette, who ran a catering company and had offered to provide the meal at cost, and who had shown up the previous afternoon with 3 hired staff, and a van full of equipment, and proceeded to transform Gloria's outdoor kitchen into something professional. There was a woman named Daphne who made signs by hand, and had arrived with a station wagon full of calligraphy boards and flower arrangements she'd sourced herself. There was a 16-year-old boy named Patrick, the son of one of the respondents, who had asked if he could take photographs because he was in the photography program at his school, and this was the most interesting assignment he'd ever stumbled into. These people, these strangers, had turned a field into a wedding in 2 weeks. I was standing at the window of Gloria's spare room, looking out at the field being set up below, when Odette's phone rang. She answered, listened for about 15 seconds, then looked at me with an expression I could not immediately read. Not alarm. Not exactly. Something more complicated. I'll put you on speaker, she said. It was Daniel's brother, Kwame, who had been roped into coordinating the groom's side of arrivals. He said in the careful tone of someone delivering news they haven't fully processed yet. There's a woman at the gate. She says she's Vivienne's mother. The room went quiet. She's not on the list, Odette said. I know she's not on the list. She knows she's not on the list. She says she isn't there for the wedding. She says she wants to speak to Vivienne before it starts, and then she'll leave. Odette looked at me. It's your call. My mother was at the gate. My mother, who had fabricated a conversation to justify canceling my venue. My mother, who had looked me in the eye at her kitchen table and said I did what I had to do. My mother, who I had told, with as much finality as I could muster, that I was getting married with or without her. She was at the gate. I thought about it for 30 seconds. Then I said, let her in. Odette's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Viv, let her in. And I need 5 minutes alone with her before anyone else comes near. She came around the side of the house while I was still in my robe, my hair half done, and she looked smaller than I remembered her. That's the only word that fits. She'd driven an hour on a Saturday morning, and she was wearing a dress I recognized, dark green with a slight shimmer, the dress she'd worn to my cousin's wedding 3 years ago. She'd done her hair. Her hands, when she reached me, were shaking slightly. I'm not here to stop anything, she said immediately. I want you to know that first. Okay, I said. I've been doing a lot of thinking since Tuesday. She paused. I've been doing a lot of thinking for longer than Tuesday, if I'm honest with you. I waited. What I did was wrong, she said. The words came out formal, like she'd practiced them, but the practice didn't touch what was underneath them. Something raw and unsteady that I hadn't heard in my mother's voice in longer than I could name. Not just the venue. The way I've been, the way I've operated. For years. She stopped. Pressed her fingers together. I've been telling myself that everything I did was for you, and some of it was true. But not all of it. The honest part is that I have been terrified for a very long time of becoming unnecessary to you. The field was full of people setting up chairs. The string quartet was doing a sound check. Somewhere behind the house, Femi was giving instructions about timing in a voice that carried authority and warmth in equal measure. I don't know if I'm fixable, my mother said. I don't know if I can promise you that I'll do better, because I've never been very good at promises I couldn't control the outcome of. But I want to try to learn how. And I wanted to say that to your face before before you go in there and start your life. I looked at her for a long moment. This was the mother I had spent 31 years trying to find underneath the version she usually presented. This was the woman I'd believed was in there. Not manufactured, not strategic, just frightened and human, and imperfect in the way that all humans are imperfect when you strip away what they use to manage their fear. You can stay, I said. For the wedding. If you want. She blinked. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm asking if you want to. She pressed her lips together, and for the first time in my memory, Renata Caldwell's composure simply gave. Not dramatically. Not in sobs or declarations. Just quietly, the way a held breath finally releases, and she nodded once, and I thought that for all the damage she'd done and all the repair that still lay ahead of us, this moment was the most honest she had ever been with me. Then go sit down, I said. Third row. And we'll talk more. After. She walked toward the field, and I went back inside to finish getting ready. The ceremony began at 4 o'clock. Gloria had been right about the light. It came through the tree line exactly as she'd described, long and gold and slanted, and it fell across the gathering place in a way that transformed everything it touched. The chairs were arranged in a wide semicircle around the hollow's natural center, and they were full. All 212 invited guests plus the 67 volunteers, plus a few neighbors of Gloria's who had wandered over when they saw the setup and been invited to stay, which was how the count climbed to something closer to 250 by the time I walked down the aisle. The aisle was a path of wildflowers that Daphne and her daughter had scattered by hand that morning, leading from the stone porch to the hollow's center where Daniel stood. He was wearing his dark suit and a tie in a shade of amber that I'd chosen months ago when the wedding was still Thornfield Manor, and string quartets and lemon lavender cake. Some things had survived. The tie had survived. I watched him see me come around the corner of the house, and the expression that crossed his face was the kind that can't be performed. It arrived before he'd organized himself, before he'd had time to compose it into something presentable, and it was just relief. Gratitude. Recognition. The face of someone who has been waiting for something and sees it finally coming. Odette walked beside me. Gloria stood near the front, a quiet anchor. The choir sang. I hadn't known about the choir until that moment. Reginald's former students, 18 of them, arranged in a curve at the edge of the hollow, and they sang something wordless and full-bodied that rose up through the golden air, and I felt it in my chest before I understood what I was hearing. There were people crying in the third row before I'd even reached the center. I glanced sideways and caught a glimpse of my mother in her dark green dress with her hands in her lap, and she was crying too, quietly, without trying to hide it. Daniel took my hands. The officiant was a friend of his from graduate school who had gotten ordained for exactly this purpose, and who spoke about what it meant to choose someone not just on the good days, but on the days when the floor shifts, and the plans dissolve, and you're standing in the rubble of what you expected, and still reaching for each other. She did not know how precisely she'd described our last 3 weeks. She'd written the speech months ago, from a different understanding. But words find their occasions. When Daniel said his vows, he added something off script. He held my hands and he said, quietly enough that it almost didn't carry, but it did. I'm sorry it took me so long to say yes to everything. I'm saying yes now. To all of it. I knew what he meant. I knew he meant Nairobi and the 3-year commitment and the conversations we'd only just started having. The life that was going to look different from the one we'd planned. Different from everything my mother had tried to contain and control and keep in a configuration that suited her comfort. I knew he meant the whole wide, unscripted thing. I'm saying yes too, I said. Also off script. The officiant smiled and kept going. The reception unfolded the way some things unfold when they've been built by many hands for love rather than money. A little rough at the edges, overflowing at the center, warmer than anything polished could be. Femi's catering was extraordinary. The cake, sourced by a stranger who had read a post at midnight and decided to give her weekend over to making it, was 4 tiers of almond and honey with pressed edible flowers on each layer. Nothing like the lemon lavender I'd ordered. More beautiful than anything I'd imagined. Patrick moved through the whole evening with his camera with the seriousness of a professional twice his age. And then something happened that I have tried multiple times to describe accurately and have never quite managed. It started after dinner, when the music shifted from the string quartet to a playlist someone had put together, and the dancing began. There was a moment, I don't know exactly when because I was dancing with Daniel and not watching the clock, where I looked out at the field, at 250 people moving through the gold-going pink evening light, and I understood something I didn't have a framework for yet. These people, most of them strangers a month ago, had looked at a post from a woman they'd never met and decided, without any obligation, that her day mattered. That her joy was worth showing up for. That a stranger's wedding was a worthy reason to give a Saturday. I thought about what Gloria had said on her porch. That's something quite extraordinary. I hadn't understood it then the way I understood it now. Odette found me near the edge of the hollow, both of us slightly breathless from dancing, and she handed me a glass of something cold and said, "You know this is going to be impossible to top." "We're moving to Nairobi," I said. She blinked. "Come again." Daniel got a job offer. Water infrastructure. Nairobi. 3 years. She stared at me for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Okay. Are we happy about this?" "I think so. I think we're terrified and happy." "That's the right combination," she said. "That means it's real." Across the field, I could see my mother talking to Gloria. I don't know when they'd found each other or what they were talking about, but Gloria had her hand on my mother's arm and was saying something, and my mother was nodding, and whatever was being said was making her hold herself differently. Less braced, less managed. I watched for a moment, then looked away. Some conversations aren't mine to witness. Daniel came up behind me and put his arms around me and said quietly, "How are you doing?" "I'm good," I said. "I'm genuinely good." "Despite everything?" "Because of everything," I said. "Because of all of it." He rested his chin on top of my head. We stood there at the edge of the gathering place, while 250 people, who had shown up for us, moved through the last of the evening light. The thing about the day my mother canceled my wedding is that it broke something open. Not the wedding. The wedding survived, transformed into something neither of us could have planned. It broke something open in me, and in my mother, and in the understanding Daniel and I had of what we were to each other. It turned out that we were not people who needed things to go according to plan. We were people who needed each other, and everything else was negotiable. We left for Nairobi in January 7 months later, with 2 suitcases each and a shipping container of essentials, and a group chat that still had 67 people in it, and that had over the intervening months become the strangest and most genuine extended family either of us had ever encountered. Reginald sent us a recording of his choir as a going-away gift. Daphne mailed us a hand-lettered print for the new apartment. Gloria texted on the morning of our flight, the first time she'd texted since the wedding, and said only, "The field says goodbye. Come back and visit." We did, eventually. We came back 2 years in for a brief trip home, and we drove out to Gloria's property on a Sunday in June, and the field was exactly as it had been, and the light at 4 o'clock still came through the tree line and turned everything gold, just like she'd said. I stood in the hollow and thought about a Tuesday evening when I'd read an email in my kitchen with my coat still on and my keys in my hand, and I thought about the 11 minutes I'd sat in my car outside my mother's porch light, and I thought about the 43-second voicemail, and the hour-long drive with the windows down, and the morning at the gate when a woman in a dark green dress arrived with shaking hands, and the truest thing she'd ever said to me. I thought about all of it. Daniel took my hand the same way he always did, unhurried, certain. "Ready," he said. I looked at the field. I looked at the light. "Yeah," I said. "Let's go."